This was the end of Naval Airship Number 1. Beyond repair, she sagged into a crumpled heap. The Mayfly had been built to Admiralty specifications, but one of the Vickers assistant engineers had earlier calculated that it would break up because of inherent structural faults. The disaster resulted in the Admiralty losing all faith in these rigid airships, but Vickers did not. Barnes-Wallis, who later went on to design the Wellington bomber and the Dam Buster's famous bouncing bomb, was brought in as one of the airship designers. When the German Zeppelins proved the value of the airship during the First World War, the Admiralty's interest was rekindled, and Barrow was asked to build them. Barnes-Wallis was put in charge, and a number of the great Leviathans of the air were completed towards the end of the war and shortly after it. This area, much changed and developed now, was the site of new large airship sheds on Walney Island in 1913. But the operation was still dogged by problems. A shortage of steel meant delays in construction. They were required to build ships of 2 million cubic feet capacity. The area needed was so big that the golf club had to lose 6 of its holes.
Barrow was chosen as a centre for Britain's airship industry because the Admiralty in 1908 wanted a firm that was used to innovation. And certainly in those days, Barrow was where innovation took place in all sorts of the defence industries, having built, of course, the first of the British submarines, and in fact built all the British submarine fleet up to that date. I think the airship industry failed because technology could not back up the hopes and desires of the people who were in favour of it. And although 4 very successful airships were built in Barrow during the First World War, this died at the end of the war. And so in 1921, the department closed down in the shipyard, and that was it as far as Barrow was concerned. The airship shed, which they had built, an immense building, just languished and deteriorated. They tried to use it to sell it for a film studio, but nothing happened and the whole thing was demolished in the early 20s.
But this wasn't Barrow's only flirtation with aviation. History was made in April 1912 when an Avro fitted with floats by Vickers took off from Cavendish Dock. This was the first aircraft to take off from seawater in Britain after early attempts the previous year had proved unsuccessful. The outbreak of the Great War in 1914 produced a huge amount of work for the shipyard. It gained increasing importance for the war effort. There was a switch to naval construction, including cruisers and a large number of submarines. Parts such as engines and boilers were made for ships that were being built elsewhere in the country. Guns and ammunition were produced. Although they were terrible years as the casualty lists grew longer and longer, the number of orders meant much work. There was a peak in employment in January 1917, when an incredible 31,000 people were on the payroll at Vickers. But after the war, the boom quickly turned to bust as a recession began to bite. Warship construction ceased, and there were efforts to build more merchant ships. But the effects were beginning to grip the town. By September 1922, the nationwide depression had reduced the payroll to just over 3,000 people. The economic doldrums only really passed in the late 1930s due to a major naval rearmament program. Once again, orders came to Barrow. Once more, the yards were a hive of activity, hustle and bustle, noise and clamour. The aircraft carriers Indomitable and Illustrious, the cruisers Jamaica and Spartan, along with 2 destroyers, were ordered. At the beginning of the Second World War, the yards were concentrating on a big ship policy. But by 1940, priorities started to change as the Navy needed more support ships, and so work went ahead on arming merchant ships and building cargo vessels and smaller destroyers. During the war, the submarine building program escalated as war under the sea became more important. Between April and October 1940, 10 U-class vessels were launched. Each one had names beginning with the letter U. Only 2 of them survived the war. Altogether, 87 submarines were built during the war years. 6 midget submarines called X-Craft were built. They were only 51 feet long and had a crew of just 4. Sadly, they were lost while attacking the Tirpitz in Norway in 1943. Luckily, most of the crew survived, but were captured. Another important side of Vickers' contribution to the war effort was the large amount of repair work and machinery building for many vessels that were being constructed elsewhere. The war years always ensured that order books were bulging at the shipyard. But even after victory was ensured, there was still plenty of work as there was a steady demand for passenger and cargo ships. By the spring of 1946, Barrow had orders worth £11.5 million. But then the economic pendulum swung the other way. 1947 saw a steel shortage. In fact, the yard only got half the amount needed. Facilities were getting dated when compared to increasing competition, ironically from countries such as Germany and Japan. This eventually led to a shortage of orders. But by the 1950s and 60s, markets had changed once again, and there was a worldwide shortage of tankers, which meant lucrative orders for Barrow. Vickers' attention turned more and more to submarines. In the 1950s, they were building experimental submarines again. This time the Explorer and Excalibur, which used hydrogen peroxide for propulsion. Britain's first nuclear-powered submarine, Dreadnought, was launched in 1960. It was such an important vessel that the Duke of Edinburgh came for the laying of the keel in 1959. 1 year later, it was the Queen herself for the launching ceremony. It was a great day and a landmark in submarine technology. Barrow was leading the way.
It was very difficult because the technology in building a nuclear submarine to the technology of building a conventional boat is totally different. You basically got a cylinder, as in a conventional submarine, which is parallel all the way through, whereas the nuclear hull itself is pear-shaped, a pear drop as opposed to a pear shape, should I say. Plus the fact it had a thicker hull. It was a deeper diving submarine, it was faster. They had stress fractures on Dreadnought because of the speed that she could go. And they adjusted the hull materials to suit, obviously, with the onset of the Valiant, which was the next one that came along from Dreadnought.
Shipbuilding techniques have changed, although some ships are still built on sloped berths. However, many launches are different from those when slipways are used. This places much stress on the hull as it hits the water. But at the Devonshire Dock Hall, they can be lowered slowly. It's not as dramatic, and the whole operation can take hours rather than a few seconds. The hall has been described as various things, such as Maggie's Farm, the Trident Shed, or Barrow's answer to Wembley Stadium.
The Devonshire Dock Hall has been a great innovation, mainly because you can work in the hall on the ships or submarines in all types of weather. You don't have a problem with rain, snow, or any of the elements whatsoever. You can carry on welding, you can do it 24 hours a day because of the lighting inside, the ventilation, and obviously all the workshops and amenities within the hall itself.
Vickers took on more workers through the 1980s, and numbers eventually grew to almost 14,500. The Devonshire Dock Hall was first conceived in 1977 and was officially opened by Margaret Thatcher in 1986, the year Vickers was privatised and became VSEL. But that ever-recurring boom and bust spell returned to haunt the town once more. 800 jobs went in 1990. There was a gradual shedding of the workforce, and eventually it seemed to bottom out at about 5,000. In recent years, there have been changes and different owners. The building of ships and submarines have dominated the economy and way of life for thousands of Barrow folk for over a century. But efforts still continue to diversify and bring different industries to the area. International conflict has generally been good news for the economy, although of course it brought heartache to many families, as it has in every village and town in the country. Barrow was very much a munitions town during the Great War. Warships, submarines, field guns and shells were churned out year after year to try to satisfy an insatiable appetite for weapons to